Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's press call about UCLA's Luskin Center for Innovation report, Adapting to Extreme Heat in California, Assessing Gaps in State-Level Policies and Funding Opportunities. My name is Olivia, and I will serve as the operator for today's call. The call will begin with remarks from our speakers, and then we will open the line for questions. All lines will be muted until that time. To place yourself in the queue to ask a question, please press star 1 at any time. Your line will be unmuted when it is your turn to ask a question. Now I'll turn it over to Greg Pierce of UCLA's Luskin Center for Innovation to start the call.
Thanks, Olivia. Thanks to everyone for joining. Again, my name is Greg Pierce. I'm the co-director of the UCLA Luskin Center for Innovation, and I'll be kicking off the call today. At the Luskin Center, we conduct rigorous research and timely outreach that informs environmental policies, particularly focused on the intersection of climate adaptation and equity. And we really focus on evaluating existing and proposed policies to assess their effectiveness, equity impacts, and potential to spur innovation. In the report, which motivates why we are here today, we found that when it comes to protecting people and communities from the risks of extreme heat in California, there are a number of policy gaps, and there are many risks that can be mitigated, which have currently split between the cracks. To fill in a lot of the details on that, I'm joined on this call by 3 colleagues who you'll be hearing from consecutively. First, from DeShazo, who's the dean at the LBJ School at the University of Texas, as well as serves as the founding director of the UCLA Luskin Center for Innovation. Next, you'll hear from Pheobe Seaton, who's the co-director of the California-based Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability. And last but not least, you'll hear from my colleague and professor and co-director of the Luskin Center, Dr. Kelly Turner. First, I want to give a little bit more motivation on why we're here and sort of the landscape of policy in California to date. Of course, I think it's obvious probably to everyone on the call that extreme heat has affected California profoundly, especially over the last several years. California has been getting hotter, both in terms of average temperatures and extreme events, and we only expect those trends to rise and to become more severe over the next several decades due to climate change. We experienced the hottest summer on record in California in 2021, as well as, incidentally, the hottest temperature ever recorded on Earth in Death Valley over the summer. Heat also has manifold impacts that we're just beginning to understand in full, including heat being consistently the largest weather-related cause of death in the United States, as well as in California, and also having profound impacts on educational and employment outcomes, making it harder for folks to learn and to work, as well as affordability impacts through sort of energy bills and other expenditures that are necessary to mitigate heat. At the same time, we want to recognize, while we do find many gaps in our analysis in California's current approach, that extreme heat is becoming a focus for the California government. California is planning and is committed to spend over $200 million over the next 2 years to address extreme heat, and is also developing a framework for heat preparedness. But in many ways, we're playing catch-up compared to our efforts and sort of ways of addressing other climate hazards, including fire, flood, and even drought. And really, the top line or major finding from the report that we're here to discuss today is that there is a lack of coordinated policy and funding at the state level. No one state agency addresses indoor or outdoor heat standards, and the resiliency, retrofit, and subsidy programs that we are funding are often indirect in their focus on heat and insufficiently funded to meet the need that we have. So despite a record state budget surplus and some momentum, we still haven't seen the coordinated legislative or funding approach that we need to mitigate the impacts of and reduce the public health risks of extreme heat across the state. But to tell us more about that and really focus in on the report that we're releasing today, I want to turn the floor over to the report's lead author, and again, the dean at the LBJ Policy School, the University of Texas at Austin, DeShazo. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pierce. I appreciate that introduction, and welcome to you all. It's a privilege for us to share our research findings with you today. This report is co-authored with Lolly Lim and Greg Pierce. Why don't we? The sort of the central motivation is that extreme heat is dangerous and is going to become more threatening and of a greater magnitude over the decades to come. And we need to think about the role of the public sector and the nonprofit sector in helping to protect our vulnerable populations from this threat. And Greg did a really nice job of enumerating the fact that we are learning very quickly about many of the impacts, the harmful impacts of heat. And we have a lot that we expect to learn in the future. And we expect the magnitude of extreme heat exposure and its harm to only increase as we learn more and more about it. The report was motivated by really three questions. First, which populations are most vulnerable to the impacts of extreme heat? And I will break that down for you in just a moment. And then, very importantly, in which settings or locations is exposure to heat particularly consequential? Because what we can do is we can make these settings more robust, more resilient to heat exposure if we plan ahead and make the appropriate investments. And then third, given the first two questions, in each of these exposure settings, which state or local agencies have the authority and the responsibility to communicate extreme heat risks and exposures and to develop policy and regulate those exposures? And what are they currently doing? And where are there gaps in their efforts that could be filled by new, more complete policy development and implementation? So the central focus of our analysis really are vulnerable populations. And you can see the list of vulnerable populations on the right side of the screen. It includes older adults, youth and infants, climate-exposed workers, low-income households, incarcerated individuals, unhoused individuals, pregnant mothers, and people with disabilities and pre-existing health conditions. And one of the things that's distinct about our approach is we ask, where are these vulnerable populations spending most of their time? In which locations do they spend most of their time? And where are they likely to, therefore, experience extreme heat exposure? And we find through our analysis, and we detail this in the report, that the settings that we're going to focus on start with the home. The home is where most of these populations that are vulnerable spend most of their time. And then certain populations occupy other locations, like the workplace. So working age adults are going to be working both at indoor workplaces and outdoor workplaces. Children are at preschool and daycare facilities as well as schools. Seniors occupy, senior assisted living facilities. Prisons, jails, correctional facilities are another exposure setting. Outdoor public spaces that include transit stops, sidewalks, parks are important exposure setting. And then public transit in general is an important potential exposure setting for these vulnerable populations. And what we do is for each of these settings, we ask certain questions. And I'll just give you an example by taking the home, the residential setting as an example. And we start off by asking, are there laws, regulations, guidance on heat exposure in that setting? And in the case of the home, there is none. Is there an agency within the state of California that is responsible for monitoring and advising or regulating heat exposure in the setting? In the case of the home, the answer is no, there isn't currently. If there was such a standard, the next question would have been, is there the authority to monitor and enforce the standard or the regulation? And again, in the case of the home, there's none. We And so just to give you an example, we also look at the interventions for each of these settings. And so in the home, we might look at things like insulation, air conditioning, shading that might be possible, other behavioral adaptation that might be possible, utility policies as well as building codes and things like that. So we look at the interventions that would make the space and the exposure setting more resilient to heat. And then for each of these 6 or 8 settings, we come to some sort of conclusions, and we assess how well state agencies responsible for that setting are currently doing in terms of recognizing heat exposure, making investments to mitigate its impacts in the future, and ask sort of what are the gaps that need to be filled. And so just to give you another example, using the residential setting, we find that people spend most of the time in homes. Older adults, infants, and those with limited mobility are particularly at risk. There is no statewide requirement or even guidelines for the design of homes that seeks to maintain indoor temperatures at sufficiently cool levels. And air conditioning is not considered a mandatory provision. So you're going to hear me say in a minute when I sort of summarize our findings, our building and safety codes now for decades have recognized that when we design buildings, we need them to have the capacity to warm occupants to a certain threshold. But none of our building and safety codes require that you cool, that your building have the capacity to cool itself and protect occupants from extreme heat. And that's, I think, one of the, and we need guidelines that would help future such standards be developed, both voluntary and mandatory standards. And we look specifically at California, and we recognize that the Cal Green Code measures related to heat reduction are voluntary; they're not mandatory. And a lot of the local planning that focuses on heat is voluntary, not mandatory. And so this is just an example for the residential setting. Just to remind you, we go through each of these 7 settings that you have in front of you, and we do detailed analysis for each one because we feel like each one supports and targets vulnerable populations that are going to be adversely impacted. So just to kind of move forward, let me just briefly get to our findings, and then we can hear from some of our other presenters. Broadly speaking, when we look across these, we looked at 10 agencies that are responsible for each of the settings, or some of the settings that we explored. And we found that there's no statewide heat exposure standard or regulation for an important set of settings. Really, there's only a standard in any consistent way for child care facilities and assisted living facilities. And as you'll hear me say in just a moment, we're very unclear on how compliance and enforcement in those 2 settings, how well it operates and exists. And so where there are standards, there tends to be this sort of limited compliance and very, very incomplete evidence on enforcement. Now, we do want to recognize that that Cal OSHA, which is the Occupational Health and Safety Agency, has led the nation in developing an outdoor extreme heat exposure rule. And of course, outdoor employers can't regulate the outdoor temperature. What they can do is allow their workers to undertake behavioral adaptations and be provided with water and shade and breaks when temperatures rise above a certain threshold. And so we do want to call out that workplace, that outdoor workplace rule. But we want to highlight, I think, the need for an indoor workplace rule as one of the really critical policy development needs of the state and one of the big gaps that currently exists. In terms of some other findings with respect to funding, the 10 agencies, the 10 state agencies that we talk about in the report, we could identify 26 potential programs that make investments in the exposure settings that I've just presented to you. However, none of those programs explicitly try and allocate funds to those parts of the state and those settings that are likely to be most impacted by extreme heat. Extreme heat isn't factored in a formal way into how these funds are administered and how these programs operate. And so that is I think, a significant challenge. Also, there's no funding for heat-focused emergency management preparation response currently. I think so, and just for those of you who might be new to the sector, most of that emergency management preparation, the frontline readiness, it happens at the local government level. And so having local governments able to be adequately prepared and receive support if they're in a part of the state that's going to be particularly hard hit by a heat wave is important. And that's pretty much going to wrap it up for me. I will say that, in addition to, if you were to ask what are the policy development priorities and the biggest gaps that we identified, I would say that indoor workplace heat rule and developing that is key. I would also say at least having guidelines on residential for renters and leasers of homes, requiring landlords to enable that at least one room in every house be able to be cooled, and having guidelines on that as at least a voluntary measure, if not mandatory, would be another policy development, especially in regions of the state that are likely to be especially hard hit by extreme heat in the future, would be another important policy area. But, for those of you that are interested in any of those exposure settings, all of them, there's ample room for all of them, there are important policy gaps that could be addressed. And as Dr. Pierce said earlier, I think the state is beginning to focus in earnest on this. And so to hear more about this, and particularly to focus on some of the environmental justice dimensions, I'd like to turn the floor over to Pheobe Seaton, the co-director for the Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability. Phoebe, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, JR, for your comments and for the research and work that you and the co-authors did. I am a co-director of Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability. We're a community-based advocacy organization based in much of inland California, specifically the San Joaquin Valley and the Coachella Valleys, areas very obviously, but very hard hit by extreme heat and really at the crosshairs of increasing heat, as also I think displayed in the map showed earlier in the presentation. I want to, I think, comment on a couple of the issues that JR, you raised. I think the home level kind of cooling at the community level and at the workplace, based on some of our experience, both in both valleys, in both the Coachella Valley and the San Joaquin Valley. I just really appreciate the acknowledgement of lack of a mandate around cooling in the home. It's just, we do have a heating standard and not a cooling standard, and we've seen that as a huge, incredibly large gap, where a lot of people that we work with don't have cooling in their home, or they have swamp coolers that just do not cool the home over 95 degrees about. And so you have many families living in extreme heat 24 hours a day. And we see that as a huge gap, both on the funding side and, quite honestly, on the regulatory side. Another issue that you touched on is energy resilience and cooling. We also see this very large gap where the energy programs aren't in place to address inefficiencies in cooling in existing, especially older homes. And so as we're looking at building out our clean energy infrastructure and resilience, we also need to look at existing buildings, which understandably is harder, but is critically important, especially for lower income households. One issue also kind of from a broader energy perspective that I want to raise is the Eastern Coachella Valley especially has been seeing just huge obstacles in terms of resilience at the household level and the community level due to inadequate energy infrastructure. So this summer, many families spent many days without energy due to power outages, and spent days and days in homes that were at 110 to 120 degrees. And as we're looking at our energy infrastructure, making sure that that doesn't happen in California or anywhere else. We also, I think, know that it's going to take us a while to get to adequately cool homes and resilient homes in California. And it's also touched on, I think, lack of coordinated emergency response. So we saw through a lot of the weather events and also COVID, the importance of having like community homes, basically community resilience centers, where people could come and share resources and have a place for access to cooling and access to resources and access to, in the event of no energy in the home, preserved food, et cetera. So that's, I think, another area that we see as an emerging opportunity at the state level is investment in community resilience centers to provide not only that important cooling, but that really critical emergency response system. That's just, we're most familiar of kind of rural communities, but really critical throughout California. Finally, at the workplace, I think that there was also, one issue that I'd kind of just like to tag on to the pieces that you mentioned is, as long as we have a workplace culture and workplace rules that where people are only compensated if they're working in extreme heat, and I think we also see this in a wildfire setting, that it would be really kind of great to see, in addition to standards, rules around workplace pay so that people aren't choosing between a paycheck and staying alive. And I'll just want to, again, not to get maybe too political, but I think that one of the things that we do see is that extreme heat is really hitting some of the communities that don't have the political power at the statewide and national level, and really appreciate that this report is elevating those communities in those areas and bringing some attention to this really critical issue. Thanks so much. And with that, I will turn things over to Kelly Turner, co-director of the Luskin Center.
Thank you, Phoebe. As you said, I'm Kelly Turner. I'm the co-director of the Wesken Center for Innovation, and I am also a faculty in the Urban Planning Department at UCLA. So we hope that this report is constructive. Heat governance is in its infancy everywhere, and in many respects, some of the actions that California has already taken put the state at the forefront of heat governance. But as the report highlights, there remains a large gap between the severity of the problem of extreme heat and our institutional capacity to address it. So we hope that this study is a starting point for pinpointing governance gaps and enhancing coordination on extreme heat in the state. This study is the latest in a series of Luskin Center for Innovation projects that are focused on 3 different but interrelated problems: extreme heat and climate change, the regional urban heat island phenomenon, and inequitable heat burden experienced by communities. And I'd like to take a moment to highlight the ongoing work on heat at the center. So first, we are committed to continuing work on heat governance in California and beyond. A recent publication in Nature enumerates heat governance actions that cities can take now. It's co-authored by Luskin Center faculty and the recently appointed director of Phoenix's new Heat Response and Mitigation Office, and points to actions like identifying institutions to take ownership over heat, echoing findings in the report discussed today, and other issues like the need for better temperature metrics capable of capturing critical differences in how heat impacts people and places. Part of heat governance is making the case for action, so we hope to provide cities and stakeholders with the tools they need to do this. please look forward to the release of the California Healthy Places Index Extreme Heat Edition, a mapping tool that will provide communities in California with data on key heat exposure and equity metrics. That is coming soon. To enable cities to craft more effective cooling solutions, we're measuring and modeling the impacts of green and gray infrastructure responses to heat in transformative climate communities throughout Southern California, working with partner firm Conky Design Initiative on developing community-driven cooling interventions in the East Coachella Valley, and the Trust for Public Land on the school setting that was highlighted today. Luskin Center faculty are also conducting a study funded by the Sustainable LA Grand Challenges and Pritzker Foundation to better understand where and when people are exposed to heat using cell phone mobility data to determine what legal and policy mechanisms are available to implement cooling actions and to design a more than shade structure using cutting-edge technology to make shade structures cooler than air. We pair these tech and data-intensive methods with studies that take a more intensive look at how neighborhoods came to be hotter than others and the lived experiences of people in those communities. Another study conducted by Luskin Center faculty examines how racist neighborhood development practices historically contributed to increased heat burden in communities of color, focusing on Watts. Finally, you may be aware of Luskin Center faculty work on the far-reaching impacts of extreme heat on vulnerable groups, such as reduced learning outcomes among school children, preterm births, and the consequences for labor and workplace safety. We are committed to continuing to make visible the far-reaching costs of extreme heat and identifying built-in institutional responses that enhance thermal conditions, especially in communities that are most vulnerable to those impacts. With that, I thank you for your time, and I'm going to give it back to J.R. DeShazo to field some questions.
So thank you so much, Dr. Turner, and we're happy to now take your questions. And I think we're going to have a facilitator tee those up for us.
Thank you. At this time, we will begin the question and answer session. To ask a question, please press star followed by 1 on your telephone keypad. Questions will be answered in the order they are received. If you have a question, press star followed by a 1 now. Please hold for a moment as we compile your responses. Our first question is coming from Kathleen with the Associated Press. Please go ahead.
Hi there. You spoke about this a little bit, and there may be more in the report, but could you talk about the extent to which the state does or does not enforce, the existing policies around extreme heat, particularly for farm workers or others? When we know these big businesses are supposed to be following certain rules, giving breaks, things like that. I get the sense from what you discussed that enforcement isn't really happening, but I wonder if someone can talk about that a little bit more extensively.
Thank you for your question. So we did not examine the effectiveness of enforcement specifically. What we know is that Cal OSHA tends to have not as many inspectors as they need, and we also know that in the 2 other settings, the child care facilities and the assisted living, that heat is on a checklist of a variety of conditions that have to be complied with, and there seems to be very little enforcement and data on the ambient temperatures during those inspections. And so in some ways, the report doesn't speak really to the central focus of your question, which is how good is enforcement in this area. I think I would, so we can't really answer that. What we do shine a light on is many exposure settings where there should be new policy developed that we'd like to be able to sort of then ask, how well is that being enforced? But I think, we're trying to highlight really in this report where new policy needs to be developed, and then ask questions for subsequent research about compliance and enforcement.
Thank you. And Kathleen, were there any further questions from your location?
Yeah, I guess, and again, I don't know if you can answer this, but at some level, one of the kind of persistent issues with state government, right, is that you can put all these new laws in place, you can set all of these new standards, but if nobody's enforcing them, they don't really matter. So I sort of wonder even what the balance is of, if the state were to adopt new policies around what landlords have to provide for renters, or some of the other things that you're discussing, indoor heat standards, et cetera. If there's no enforcement, it's sort of a meaningless policy, right? So I don't really know what the question is, other than to say, if some of these policy proposals that you're suggesting are adopted, do you think that is there anything that needs to be included in that policy to sort of better ensure that the policy is carried out?
Yeah, that latter part is a fantastic question. And I'll just highlight that it is not difficult to measure the ambient temperature of a space. It's the cost of these sensors now is extremely low, and the opportunities for distributed sensing are very, very high, especially in most of the settings that we focused on, where you could have a stationary thermometer that provided information. And so self-regulation by the occupants of these spaces in some cases can be effective. In other cases, as you point out, in the rulemaking, the regulations themselves, there should be a compliance system set up where measurements are taken on a regular basis, and that would need to be that monitoring function. And that reporting function should be developed on a setting by setting basis.
Thank you. And again, as a reminder to our audience, you may ask a question by pressing *1 now. Our next question comes from Tony with the LA Times. Please go ahead.
Hi, thanks so much for doing this. I was really interested in in what you said about one of the biggest gaps being the lack of a cooling standard for residences. I was just wondering if you could tell us a little more about how something like that might work. Are there other jurisdictions that you've looked at that have something like that? Would this require legislation? Could it be done administratively by like a state agency? I was just hoping to get you to flesh that out a little bit more. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Tony. It's a great question. The way that we do it for warming right now is just to require that any new permanent structure have the capacity to warm itself. So there has to be a technology that allows for warming, and that technology is sized to the space, right? So this is typically taken care of for warming through a technology standard. And so that is specified when the structure is designed and permitted. And one could do the same thing for new structures for cooling as we move forward. So that you don't actually even have to necessarily address the question of what is the threshold temperature, although I think it's really important for us to move towards that conversation of what are acceptable threshold temperatures and over what time periods for these different settings. We need to have that conversation of what are harmful exposures for different populations and in different settings. but a technology standard would do it for new construction. For retrofits, again, you could focus simply on air conditioning technologies if that's what you wanted to cool one room in a retrofitting kind of a way. If you were a landlord, either commercial or residential property landlord, requiring that spaces be cooled with those technologies. That has become political as environmental groups have lobbied against air conditioning technologies. But I think that there are a lot of advocates for very low income and immigrant workers in California who recognize that that's a critical protective technology that they should at least have available to themselves. And then a complementary issue, Tony, that's really important is housing quality. So if the house is very old or incredibly poorly insulated and not weatherproof, you can put a cooling technology in a room, but it could be exorbitantly expensive to operate if that space isn't weatherproof. And that is, I think, going to be a problem that we have to confront as a state. And I don't have a simple solution to that because that is a very challenging issue.
Thanks. And just to make sure, you're saying that like officials of the state should be considering at least like establishing some sort of guideline that landlords would have to provide cooling to at least one room? I just wanted to make sure I understood that.
I think in certain climate zones, that could be a very appropriate guideline at this stage. Yes, it will, I want to acknowledge, it will increase the cost of housing. That is a consequence of requiring this, but in certain climate zones that are going to experience, significant increases, sometimes a doubling of extreme heat days, creating the capacity to use that technology and making it available, I think is going to become incredibly important in the future of California. Not in all the climate zones, I want to be clear. And we currently divide the state for our utility management purposes into climate zones. And so there are one of the things we highlighted in the report is there are a lot of existing programs to build on. California isn't, basically the challenge is how do we piggyback the heat adaptive policies onto the 26 existing programs that are already moving resources and guidance down to these different exposure settings at the local level.
Thank you. As a reminder to our audience, you may enter the question queue by pressing *1 on your telephone keypad. Again, that is *1 to ask a question. Our next question will come from Deborah with Accelerate Resilience Los Angeles. Please go ahead.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. I'm wondering, as you're looking at governance issues, if you were also able to look at conflicts really amongst these 10 agencies at the state level, specifically with regards to new state incentives for things like ADUs, which is fantastic for homelessness, but takes up needed land space for trees that could also provide urban cooling benefits for these same vulnerable populations. Does your report look at some of these governance conflicts and how to resolve these?
So our report does not, but I would like to give Dr. Turner, who actually studies this question outside of the report, a chance to respond to your question.
Thanks. Can you hear me? Okay. So we don't think that ADUs are going to significantly affect things like the urban heat island. They're just too small scale. But in order to moderate concerns about that, I would point to a recent code put out by the city of Tucson requiring cool roofs on all new ADUs. And then just to follow up on the previous question, there was a bit of the question that I can address. The Arch Rockefeller Foundation just put out a national report and found that no city has a cool standard or an AC requirement in the United States currently.
Thank you. Deborah, did you have any further questions, or our speakers, were there any further responses?
Not at this time.
Thank you. We will go next to Jonathan with Climate Resolve. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much for your work on this important report. My question is in regards to recent funding by the state of California. The state has set aside $800 million on extreme heat measures, and yet there are no dollars going to the California Public Health Department. Do you see a role for public health in addressing extreme heat?
Thank you, Jonathan, for that question. It's a great question, and I think that absolutely part of the challenge in preparing for greater extreme heat is education, and health education in particular. And the local health departments already have relationships with many of these vulnerable populations that are with whom they're providing other services. And, you know, in addition to making the built environment more resilient, there will always be the need to give people behavioral adaptations and ways that they can change where they are and who they're with, and as they're trying to weather a extreme heat event. And the health department is often a conduit of information to pregnant mothers, senior citizens with various kinds of health and other disabilities, you know, a wide range of the population that is touched by the public health department. So I think that is an important conduit, Jonathan.
Thank you. We will move now to our next caller. That is Tom with Healthy Building Research in chps.net. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you for pulling all this together. I look forward to reading it soon. I'm glad you're addressing some of these key indoor exposure issues, because we know about 60% of the deaths occurred indoors during the big 06 heat wave, and we'll expect to see a lot more in the coming decades. So my question, I guess, is that I know UCLA and Arizona State have done some great work modeling the building stock and the energy efficiency under future climate and the grid demands, and also the buildup of indoor heat without power in various types of buildings in the LA area. And I was just wondering if there's been follow-up work on that to start targeting those buildings, or actually measure things out in the field and do interventions. And in general, I would encourage folks to add on cooling, passive cooling type measures to weatherization projects and other projects, because it can be very cost effective when you actually do a life cycle analysis. So thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Dr. Turner, would you like to speak to any of those questions?
Sure. Well, I don't focus on indoor building exposure, and so I wasn't a part of, or I'm not intimately aware of and able to speak to the specific reports that you're mentioning. However, I will concur that paying attention to building stock is huge, that we can't address our problems of extreme heat without addressing the problem of housing and problems of infrastructure, and that while urban greening kind of interventions and tech interventions on kind of the other two ends of the spectrum are both very important, that addressing sort of underlooked things like roofs and our values of walls are super important. And I would highlight again things like inadequate housing, mobile homes, that kind of thing. We need to address those. Yeah.
Can I mention just two things? I don't know if you've looked at it, but there are some places that have looked at indoor heat warning systems where they take, say, an apartment that's most vulnerable, say, for elderly or whatever, and you know, as a major typology, and they model it under forecasted weather within the next few days, an expected heat wave. And Germany's done that for years. And I think they have some data to suggest that it's been helpful. And then I think the UK has now demonstrated maybe a similar approach. So this is kind of along the lines of public awareness and naming heat waves and mobilizing people and getting the cooling centers ready and make sure they actually work. Because San Francisco found out that it couldn't keep their cooling center cool a few years ago. So for emergency response, there's things like that I don't know if you've looked at, but might be worth thinking about.
So, Tom, thank you so much for your comments and reflections. Just a couple of follow-ons. You know, our report focused on extreme heat governance. I want to point out that there's a very basic exercise that the state of California and nowhere, to my knowledge, in the U.S. have carefully done, which is a heat exposure assessment, which would describe the actual heat exposure, either predicted or actual, to individuals with different characteristics over different time periods. And that heat exposure assessment, it would be the next step in planning for protective investments. And it needs to be done. And some of the elements that some of the studies you're describing where we forecast indoor air temperatures during a power outage or even if only limited, cooling, cooling levels would be part of that extreme heat exposure assessment. And that is really important for us as a state to know, because that will give us the numbers on the potential magnitude of harm that is being experienced by different groups. And then the other thing that I just, your comment calls to mind is our study really did not do a careful assessment in any way of building and safety codes for these different types of built environment settings. We did not look specifically at local government readiness and policy gaps in building codes at the local level. That is a limitation of our study. We just couldn't do everything, and we chose to focus on state agencies. But that also is something that scholars like Dr. Turner and Dr. Pierce and some other folks on the call today have started to look at. And I think that's going to be a very important area of policy development as well.
Great.
Thank you. I would now like to turn the conference back to Greg Pierce for closing remarks.
All right. Well, thanks to everyone for joining the call and your great questions, and to my colleagues, Dr. DeShazo, Dr. Turner, and Pheobe Seaton. I want to note that the report that we've been discussing here today is now live on our website, but also all the participants in the call will receive a direct link to the report. And we invite reporters to contact Karina Daniels if they have further questions and would like to receive the study, as well as ourselves. Karina, though, can be reached at CARINA@storyandreach.com, or her phone number is 510-847-1617. But with that, again, I want to thank everyone, and have a great day. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your attention. This concludes today's conference.